Okay, so let's continue on our discussion. This is the primary motor cortex here, and you can see that each part represents a different part of the body, and it stimulates these different parts: the face, the tongue, the larynx, the hand, the arm. And this creature here is a homunculus, and it's a pictorial representation of the anatomical divisions of the primary motor cortex and the primary somatosensory cortex. So the portion of the brain directly responsible for movement is the primary motor cortex, and the exchange of sensory information is the somatosensory cortex. So the larger parts here indicates how much brain power is dedicated to controlling them and how many sensory receptors there are. Okay, so the frontal lobe sends most of the motor commands to the muscles of your body. So when you think about how you want to move your arm or leg, the primary motor strip sends information out of the brain from the primary motor cortex, out of the brain, down the spinal cord to the muscles of your body to move. Now, we also know that the frontal lobe is really important for personality, planning, and decision making. And one of the cases that we learned about personality being in the seat of the frontal lobe is the case of Phineas Gage. So how many of y'all have heard this story, maybe in some of your psychology classes? You might have heard it. So a 13-pound iron rod shot through the brain of a railroad construction foreman, Phineas Gage, in Vermont in 1848. And he lived 11 more years after this accident and was able to talk and walk and function as normally as he had in the past. But as his doctor said, Gage was no longer Gage. So this dampener went straight through his frontal lobe here. And what happened afterwards was his manner darkened. He became coarse and chaotic when he before had been a really affable, dependable person. The true story of a medical oddity that continues to intrigue doctors. So here you can see another picture. This is on display in a museum. But here you can see this tamping rod that went straight through his frontal lobe. So his personality completely changed after this accident. However, he's still able to function. Okay, so we're still on the frontal lobe. So we've talked a little bit about how there's this primary motor cortex, and it's responsible for controlling the muscles of your body. It's at the very back of the frontal lobe. And so it sends out commands that produce movements of your fingers, hands, arms, legs, feet, etc. It's organized so that there is one area that controls the hand, one area that controls the leg, one that controls the foot, etc. So there's the primary motor cortex extends both in the left and right hemispheres, and the primary motor cortex in the left hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and the primary motor cortex in your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body. Okay, so here's this primary motor cortex strip down here that also extends onto the other side of your brain as well. Okay, Broca's area is also in the frontal lobe. However, it's only in the left frontal lobe, in the left hemisphere, the frontal lobe in the left hemisphere. So this region of the brain, you can see it's here. This is responsible for speech production. So actually producing sounds that come out of our mouth is from Broca's area, and it's named after Paul Broca, a French doctor. In the 1860s, he discovered that damage to this area in the left hemisphere, but not the right, caused extreme difficulty with speech production. And so when you have damage to the Broca's area, Typically, you see damage to the Broca's area after a stroke. This causes Broca's aphasia. Okay, so now let's move back to the next lobe of the brain. This is the parietal lobe here, and it processes most of the sensory memory information from the body, so pain, temperature, touch, your sense of your body position in space, where you are. All of this is processed in the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, this processes visual information. So this is the lobe that's in the very back of the brain. We process vision here. So here's a picture of the occipital lobe here. Okay, now when we move on to the temporal lobe here on the sides of your brain, it's really important for hearing and the processing of both auditory information and visual input. So there's a really important role for language in our temporal lobe and then again in our frontal lobe. So the temporal lobe, there's auditory perception and receptive language processing. So do y'all remember from your 101 class, you talked about expressive language and receptive language? Expressive language is when you actually produce speech, and receptive language is understanding speech. Well, the comprehension of speech is processed in the temporal lobe in Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is processing the comprehension of speech. And there's also the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobes. So if you look at Wernicke's area, this area is back here. So this was the Broca's area in the frontal lobe, and this is Wernicke's area here in the temporal lobe. And it's responsible for understanding spoken language. So it's named after Carl Wernicke. So it looks like it should be pronounced Wernicke with a W, but it should be pronounced with a V, Wernicke's area. Carl Wernicke was a German doctor in the 1870s that reported that patients with damage to this area of the brain had difficulty comprehending speech. They really couldn't understand speech very well. Okay, so let's take a minute and sum up. So we've talked about how there are 4 major lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobes. Now, there is one other hidden lobe of the brain, which if you cut away here, you can see another cerebrum here. This is the insula. The insula is thought to play a role in speech. So just know, we're not going to go into much detail about it, but just know the hidden lobe is the insula. Okay, the limbic lobe, this is just a collection of parts of the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. So it's not a really specific region, it's just parts of each of these frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. And so you can see there's a picture of the limbic lobes in here. And so it's for the limbic lobes process emotion, sexual function, and feeding. And so there's 2 structures in the limbic lobe that we're going to talk about: the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is really important in learning and memory. And then there's also the amygdala, which processes emotions. Okay, so let's look at we've been talking about the surface area of the brain, the cerebrum. So let's look at some subcortical areas of the brain. This just means below the cortex. So areas of gray matter below the cerebrum are white matter. So let's look at some of these structures within the brain. So the basal ganglia, you can see the basal ganglia here. The basal ganglia helps control movement. The thalamus structure, you can see the thalamus in here. The thalamus is involved in several functions of the body, including motor control, and it receives auditory, somatosensory, and visual sensory signals, and it relays these sensory signals to the cerebral cortex. Okay, it also helps control sleep and awake states. The hypothalamus, this is involved in several functions of the body, including autonomic function control, endocrine function control, homeostasis, motor function control, food and water intake regulation, and sleep-wake cycle regulation. Okay, so these are just a couple of subcortical areas we're going to talk about. Now, the cerebellum, this is the structure in the very back of the brain here. The cerebellum also can be broken up into two hemispheres. The cerebellum is for coordination, movement, and balance. So for really fine movement coordination, balance and equilibrium, and muscle tone, all of this is controlled in the cerebellum. So here you can see this is the cerebellum that's cut away from the brain. And if you were to slice it open, it looks like this tree-like structure here. So this is a lateral view. So if we were to cut down one of the and cut the hemispheres into left and right, you can see the cerebellum here in the back.